You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your PMP certification journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Procurement in project management is about far more than simply purchasing goods or services. It is the discipline of deciding what to buy, how to buy it, and how to manage vendors so that outcomes support project objectives. The goal is clarity, risk-sharing, compliance, and ultimately value. Every contract represents an allocation of responsibility between buyer and seller. If terms are vague or relationships unmanaged, the project inherits risk. The project manager's stance must be that of steward, ensuring contracts protect value, while relationships remain professional and fair. On the exam, STEMs often test this when statements of work are ambiguous, vendors fall behind schedule, or changes are requested without documentation. Procurement begins with strategy, and strategy begins with make-or-buy analysis. This analysis asks whether it is better to produce in-house or to procure externally. The evaluation includes cost comparisons, but also capability, time, and risk. For example, a company may lack expertise in cybersecurity and therefore must buy specialized services rather than train staff mid-project. Procurement strategy also includes competitive versus single-source choices. Competitive bidding may yield better price and transparency, but sometimes a single trusted supplier is justified. Phased buying strategies can reduce risk by securing critical items early. On the exam, correct answers stress structured analysis, not impulsive decisions. Timing matters. Procurement must align with the project schedule and risk profile. Buying too late creates delays, while buying too early may waste money or create storage costs. Early market research also sets realistic expectations. If vendors typically need 6 months for delivery, the schedule must reflect that constraint. PMI expects project managers to balance ambition with realism by aligning procurement to the overall delivery plan. Exam STEMs often disguise this as delays due to vendor lead times. The correct answer usually involves earlier planning, not wishful rescheduling. At the heart of every procurement is the statement of work, often abbreviated SOW. A good SOW is measurable, clear, and specific. It describes deliverables, acceptance criteria, interfaces, and non-functional requirements such as performance or security. It defines how deliverables will be inspected, what evidence will be required, and how compliance will be proven. It may also include clauses on data handling, privacy, or safety. Ambiguity in a SOW is a recipe for disputes. Attaching relevant artifacts, drawings, or references reduces misunderstandings. On the exam, when a vendor delivers something close but not correct, the root cause is often a vague SOW. Acceptance methods belong in the SOW as well. For example, a vendor delivering software must know whether acceptance requires demonstration, written test results, or customer sign-off. Without clarity, disagreements arise. Privacy, data, and security obligations must also be explicitly spelled out. For projects involving multiple vendors, interface requirements are especially critical. Each vendor must know where its responsibility ends and another begins. PMI stresses that the SOW is the anchor for accountability. On the exam, distractors often suggest relying on goodwill or later negotiation. The correct answers emphasize well-written, testable SOWs from the start. Once the SOW is ready, the project manager oversees source selection. This may begin with a request for information, or RFI, to survey the market. A request for quotation, or RFQ, is used when the requirement is clear and price is the main factor. A request for proposal, or RFP, is used when both technical approach and cost matter. Pre-bid conferences allow vendors to clarify questions, ensuring fairness. Evaluation criteria include technical capability, past performance, price, and risk factors. On the exam, STEMs that ask how to select the best vendor are testing whether you use structured, documented evaluation, not informal preference. Evaluation must be transparent. Weighting matrices often help, assigning percentages to factors such as price, capability, and risk. For example, technical capability might weigh 40%, past performance 30%, and price 30%. Documenting these weights prevents accusations of bias. Decisions must be recorded, and vendors deserve debriefs when possible. This preserves relationships and improves future bids. PMI emphasizes that procurement is not only about choosing a vendor, but about preserving integrity and fairness in the process. On the exam, the correct answer usually involves structured evaluation, not informal or undocumented decisions. Contract type selection is where procurement strategy meets risk sharing. Fixed-price contracts transfer risk to the seller, since they must deliver for an agreed amount regardless of actual cost. These work best when scope is clear and stable. Time and materials contracts shift risk toward the buyer, since payment is based on effort expended. These are useful when scope is less defined, but time sensitivity is high. Cost-reimbursable contracts involve the buyer paying actual costs, plus a fee, often used when uncertainty is significant. Each family has variance, chosen based on scope clarity and risk appetite. Incentive contracts adjust risk sharing further. Fixed price incentive fee, or FPIF, contracts set a target cost, target profit, and share ratio for overruns or underruns. Cost plus incentive fee, or CPIF, contracts reimburse costs and adjust fees based on performance. Award fee contracts provide discretionary bonuses for exceptional performance. The key principle is that incentives align the seller's behavior with the buyer's goals. On the exam, STEMs often test whether you know which contract type balances risk appropriately. The correct answer usually emphasizes aligning contract type to scope clarity and risk appetite, not choosing by price alone. Change mechanisms must also be set in contracts. Projects evolve, and contracts must define how scope, cost, and schedule changes will be handled. Formal contract modifications, sometimes called change orders, prevent disputes. Dispute resolution clauses, mediation, arbitration, or escalation ladders provide paths before conflicts turn into litigation. PMI stresses that contracts are not static. They are living agreements that must accommodate change. On the exam, distractors often suggest implementing vendor changes informally. The correct answer emphasizes following contractual change mechanisms. The project manager's role in procurement is both technical and relational. Technically, you must ensure that contracts reflect project objectives, risks, and constraints. Relationally, you must manage interactions with vendors as professional partnerships. Too much rigidity creates friction. Too much flexibility erodes governance. PMI describes the project manager as a steward, someone who ensures contracts deliver value while relationships remain functional. On the exam, when you see vendor delays or disputes, the correct answer usually involves returning to the contract and managing within its terms, not improvising. Procurement also requires aligning with compliance. Some industries mandate specific procurement processes, competitive bidding thresholds, or audit trails. Non-compliance can invalidate contracts or create legal exposure. The project manager ensures that procurement strategies meet both organizational and regulatory requirements. This adds another dimension to contract type and vendor selection. On the exam, scenarios about audits or compliance usually point to the need for following policy, not taking shortcuts. Correct answers emphasize compliance and documentation as part of procurement integrity. Vendor market research is another preventative measure. Understanding market norms for cost, delivery times, and capacity ensures realistic planning. For example, assuming a vendor can deliver custom hardware in 3 months when the market standard is 6 creates unrealistic expectations. Research prevents this by anchoring assumptions in evidence. PMI stresses that procurement strategy must be grounded in what vendors can actually provide. On the exam, STEMs describing unexpected vendor delays often trace back to missing or poor market research. correct answers usually involve earlier, more thorough research. In summary, Part 1 of this task covered strategy, make or buy, statements of work, source selection, and contract types. Procurement planning is about balancing risk, clarity, and fairness. The project manager's stance is that of steward, ensuring contracts reflect reality, relationships remain professional, and outcomes align with project objectives. On the exam, pitfalls include vague SOWs, casual vendor selection, ignoring compliance, or mismatching contract type to risk. The correct answers consistently stress structure, research markets, write clear SOWs, use documented selection criteria, and choose contract types that match scope clarity and risk appetite. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Incentive contracts are designed to align the seller's behavior with the buyer's goals, and the math behind them deserves close attention. A fixed-price incentive fee contract begins with 4 terms: the target cost, the target profit, the ceiling price, and the share ratio. The target cost is what both parties expect the work will cost. The target profit is the agreed fee at that cost. The target price is simply target cost plus target profit. The ceiling price is the maximum the buyer will ever pay. The share ratio describes how overruns or underruns are split. For example, a 70-30 ratio means the buyer covers 70% of overruns, while the seller covers 30%. The point of total assumption, or PTA, is the cost level where the seller takes on all further overruns. It is calculated using a simple formula. Subtract the target price from the ceiling price, then divide that number by the buyer's share of cost risk, and finally add the result to the target cost. For example, suppose the target cost is $1 million, the target profit is $100,000, and the ceiling price is $1,200,000. The target price is therefore $1,100,000. Subtracting gives $100,000. If the buyer share is 70%, divide $100,000 by 0.7 to get about $143,000. Adding that to the target cost gives a PTA of about $1,143,000. What this means is straightforward. Up to the PTA, overruns are shared according to the ratio. Beyond the PTA, the seller loses dollar for dollar because the ceiling price caps what the buyer will pay. If actual costs rise well above the PTA, the seller's profit evaporates and may even become a loss. On the exam, correct answers emphasize calculating PTA, comparing it with forecast costs, and recognizing when the seller faces severe pressure. PMI expects you to interpret what PTA means, not just memorize the formula. The takeaway is simple. If costs will exceed PTA, oversight and collaboration are urgently needed. Cost plus incentive fee contracts follow similar logic but adjust the fee instead of capping price. The formula is target fee plus the seller's share multiplied by the difference between target cost and actual cost. If actual costs are lower than target, the fee increases. If actual costs are higher, the fee decreases. For example, if the target cost is $1 million and the actual cost is $900,000, the seller earns extra fee for saving the buyer money. These mechanisms encourage efficiency and align behavior. On the exam, correct answers stress that incentives are about alignment, not punishment. Administering procurements requires rigor once contracts are signed. A kickoff meeting is essential to establish roles, responsibilities, communication methods, reporting requirements, and the escalation ladder. This ensures both buyer and seller understand how performance will be measured and how disputes will be addressed. Regular performance reviews and inspections follow, verifying deliverables against contract terms and acceptance criteria. Change requests are processed formally as contract modifications or change orders. Objective records are kept, both to track progress and to prevent claims. On the exam, correct answers emphasize structured contract administration, not informal arrangements or verbal assurances. Performance reviews are not just audits, they are relationship checkpoints. The project manager must ensure that vendors see reviews as collaborative, not adversarial. For example, a late delivery should trigger analysis and corrective action, not immediate penalties unless terms require it. PMI emphasizes maintaining professionalism and fairness. Documentation, however, must be objective and complete. If a dispute escalates, records of performance, communications, and decisions provide protection. On the exam, stems about vendor disputes usually point toward maintaining records and following contract procedures, not relying on informal negotiation. Vendor risk management is part of ongoing administration. Suppliers face their own risks, financial instability, capacity limits, or geopolitical disruptions. The project manager must track these risks in the project's risk register, define triggers, and prepare response plans. Service level agreements, or SLAs, formalize expectations for performance, and service credits provide remedies for shortfalls. Chronic performance issues may require corrective action plans, where the vendor commits to specific improvements within defined timeframes. On the exam, correct answers balance firmness with fairness, address risks professionally, preserve options, and maintain the ability to enforce terms if necessary. Relationship management matters as much as technical administration. Vendors are partners, not adversaries. While contracts define obligations, trust and professionalism sustain performance. Burning bridges with vendors may limit future sourcing options. PMI emphasizes that project managers must be fair, transparent, and respectful, even when holding vendors accountable. On the exam, stems about vendor conflict often test whether you recognize the need for fairness and communication alongside enforcement. The correct answers rarely involve immediately terminate the contract unless trust and remedies have been exhausted. Let's ground this with a scenario. Imagine a fixed-price incentive fee contract with a PTA of $1,143,000. Forecasted actual costs are trending toward $1,200,000. The project manager has four options: ignore the problem since the seller bears the risk, revisit scope and risk sharing, increase oversight and collaborate on cost reduction, or terminate immediately. The best choice is to compute and confirm the PTA, then collaborate with the seller on cost control or scope adjustments, raising a formal change request if needed. Ignoring the issue is short-sighted, and termination is premature. If the same scenario were under a cost-plus incentive fee contract, the dynamics would be different. There would be no ceiling price. Instead, the seller's fee would adjust downward as costs exceeded the target. The buyer would still reimburse costs, but the seller would feel pressure through reduced profit. The project manager must communicate this clearly and ensure stakeholders understand the mechanics. On the exam, stems may test whether you recognize that FPIF has a ceiling price, while CPIF adjusts fees but continues reimbursement. Correct answers depend on interpreting the contract type correctly. Closeout of procurements is the final act. It begins with verifying deliverables and ensuring all acceptance criteria are met. Open claims must be resolved, whether through negotiation, mediation, or arbitration. Final payments are processed once obligations are satisfied. Releases of liens or claims protect the buyer from future disputes. Assets are handed over, warranties are confirmed, and ongoing support obligations are documented. The exam often frames this as final acceptance of deliverables. The correct answer is to follow closeout steps systematically, not to terminate the relationship abruptly. Archiving records is part of closeout discipline. Every contract, modification, inspection record, and performance review must be stored in an accessible repository. This protects the organization in case of audits and creates lessons learned for future projects. Claims history, successful incentive structures, and vendor performance data all inform future procurement strategies. PMI emphasizes that knowledge management extends to procurement as much as to technical delivery. On the exam, stems that describe missing records often point toward the importance of archiving. Correct answers emphasize organized, accessible records as part of closeout. Lessons learned are another valuable output of procurement closeout. Did the chosen contract type work well for the level of risk? Were the SOWs clear enough to prevent disputes? Did the evaluation criteria predict actual performance? Capturing these insights strengthens organizational maturity. They can influence whether future projects lean more on fixed-price or cost-reimbursable contracts, or whether evaluation matrices need adjustments. PMI expects project managers to close the loop by feeding procurement experiences into organizational knowledge. On the exam, look for answers that emphasize documenting lessons, not discarding experience. In conclusion, procurement is about strategy, clarity, and stewardship. Incentive contracts align behavior, and the point of total assumption shows where seller risk becomes total. Administration ensures that vendors deliver value within agreed terms, while risk and relationship management sustain performance. Scenario analysis demonstrates that ignoring PTA or skipping oversight undermines success. Closeout confirms acceptance, resolves claims, and captures lessons. On the exam, pitfalls include vague SOWs, ignoring PTA math, skipping documentation, or mishandling vendor disputes. Correct answers consistently emphasize analysis, fairness, and structured governance. Procurement, when managed well, transforms vendors from risks into value-delivering partners. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.